from that standpoint, I'm very optimistic on technology and where it's heading. That means we're going to need an awful lot of nickel, and that will be a major challenge that I think will be very, very difficult for the nickel industry to respond to.
Hello, welcome to Assay TV. Today I'm joined by Ken Hoffman, who is the co-head of EV battery materials research at McKinsey & Co. Ken, great to see you. Where are you today? It looks like a lovely house you're in there.
Yes, I'm like everyone else. COVID, this is the nicest house in my room to do these video calls. It's my living room here in Chester, New Jersey, which is around 80 kilometers west of New York City.
Fantastic. So Ken, today we're going to be talking a little bit about battery materials and particularly nickel. After Tesla's battery day, obviously everyone was talking about nickel. But to start us off, if you could just sort of set the scene a little bit. Nickel is one of the more abundant sort of metals around in the Earth's crust, but it's not all about just nickel. We want the Class 1 battery grade nickel. Could you just explain to our viewers what's the difference between the Class 1 high grade nickel that you need for batteries and the sort of more common or garden nickel that goes into stainless steel alloys?
Certainly. EVs have suddenly sort of burst into the scene here over the last few years. Remember, the EV industry is very new. In 2012, there was less than 50,000 EVs sold in the world. This year, we should exceed 2 million. And if our indications are right, by 2030, we should be in the 25 million units. So it's going to become more and more mainstream. And what makes batteries more mainstream when we talk to consumers, there's two main aspects that they want in an electric vehicle. And that is to pretty much match what they have today in the petrol car. So they want range and they want recharge time. The range they want is around 650 kilometers to 900 kilometers. And the recharge time they want about 5-6 minutes. That's how long it takes to refill your car. When we talk about range, the batteries need to have nickel, basically. So you have a cathode and you have an anode in a battery where the electrons go back and forth. The cathode is where the nickel relies, and the electrons actually hook up with the nickel, to say it easier. There's also some cobalt, some manganese, some aluminum in there, depending on the chemistry. That's there to sort of stabilize and make sure things don't get too carried away with the nickel. But nickel, the more nickel you can put in there, the better. And as we become better and better at making these batteries, what we're finding is the nickel quality needs to be finer and finer and finer. So from 2 nines to 3 nines to 4 nines. The specs for nickel can be in the detriments cannot be more than 1 or 2 parts per billion. So extremely tight tolerances. Now, there's only so many nickels that can be refined and re-refined by the cell manufacturers to get to such a tight tolerance. And so we call that nickel that we believe can be relatively easily refined into a cathode to be called Class 1. The other types of nickel, particularly the ferronickels that are very high in iron content, will be very difficult, very costly to try to purify them again and again and again to get down to that state. So we call that Class 2. We believe that material will continue to be used for the stainless steel industry.
Is it just iron that are the impurities that you want to get out, or are there other things that you want to avoid?
There's about 15 different detriments that could be in the nickel or in the lithium or in the other different areas. You really need as pure of a pathway between one side of the battery and the other. Anything that comes in there, it could be sodium, potassium, it could be all sorts of different contaminants in there. Even copper, if it's in the wrong part of the battery cathode, that over time it will reduce the quality of the battery. And so what will happen is it will seem pretty good to begin with and then very quickly deteriorate. As we sort of move from one chemistry to the other, as we've sort of rapidly improved the chemistry, you'll actually see about a 30% reject rate in the first year or so of new batteries because the raw materials aren't pure enough, aren't configured perfectly for that battery. And that's why cell manufacturers, by and large, have never made any money. So if you look at Panasonic or LG or SK, they don't really make money because they have such a high reject rate. We've tailored that back. It's really the raw material provider's issue. So for the raw material providers that can provide that, their margins actually have been very, very good.
Mm-hmm. But looking at the overall market for Class 1 nickel, I mean, how much Class 1 nickel is required and how much is currently being produced?
It all really depends on who you believe on where this industry is going. And that's why Tesla's battery day was so important, because Tesla believes that by mass marketing and making these batteries, they can drop the cost, they said, by about 56%, which would roughly equate to about $53 a kilowatt hour versus best in class today, which is about $100 a kilowatt hour. That really gives you sort of the killer app that would make petrol cars completely obsolete. We've sort of done our analysis to say it's probably going to get hard to get everything Tesla said they can get to, but they can probably drop that cost very, very significantly. The lower you drop that cost, the more accepting to the marketplace you would see that battery, and the more batteries produced, therefore the more nickel that can be used. If we use Tesla numbers, the nickel needed for their batteries would be something on the order of 2 to 3 times what is produced in nickel markets today. A massive increase in nickel. We believe that you'll probably see about a doubling of nickel demand over the next decade, which is still very, very significant. And almost all of it will be in that Class 1 area. And that's the area we're most concerned about. We actually put to Class 1 versus Class 2. We think we have plenty of Class 2 nickel for the stainless market, along with scrap. We think there's plenty for the stainless market. However, that Class 1 nickel that you need, that's only maybe about 10 to 15% of the Class 1 market today. As that market grows 10-fold, 15-fold, 20-fold, as the battery packs get bigger and bigger, as stationary storage becomes very, very large, and they'll need a lot of nickel in those batteries, suddenly you have a real problem trying to find nickel supply.
And it's not just about volumes, is it? Because Elon is also saying that he wants clean nickel. All of the battery manufacturers say they want, environmentally, sustainably sourced nickel. So what are the standards that they're looking for? And how do those aspirations sort of compare with the way that nickel is produced, or this Class 1 nickel is produced today?
Well, these are all brand new ideas and standards, and there really isn't any standard for what is clean nickel and what is not. However, you've seen companies such as Tesla who have been very vocal, and you've seen the European Union, which is also trying to set some standards, start to come around to some ideas about what clean nickel is. What they're telling the OEMs, the automakers, you need to tell us in that vehicle how much CO2 was needed to make all the materials in that car, SO2, how much water was being used in the manufacture of all those raw materials. And they're going to calculate that up, and you're starting to see car makers tell you how much CO2 was used to produce X car. Nickel is actually one of the highest CO2 producing parts of the battery. The battery is the most CO2 part of the car, so it's really being focused upon. And so that's a real big issue. There are certain red lines that you cannot go over. And the red lines are no child labor, particularly for cobalt in the DRC, and no ocean tailing dumping. None of these automakers want nickel that if you dumped your tailings into the ocean, that is just out. And so as one EV manufacturer told me, it's more important for us to see companies committed to major changes and reduction of their sort of emissions rather than an X number. And since there is no X number to shoot for, as long as you're showing that you're constantly progressing and making a better environmental impact, then therefore, that's something that they're looking for.
I mean, when they're talking about sort of things like no tailings dumpings in the oceans and obviously no child labor, does that mean that you're going to see people favoring certain jurisdictions over others?
It'd be interesting. I do think one of the things, we've always looked for a problem for blockchain to solve. This could be one where the mining company will set up its standards. That material will be tracked from the mine through even, say, the LME, if it goes through there, or other exchanges to the end user so they can have a certification. I don't think it has to be jurisdictional, that there's a good jurisdiction or a bad jurisdiction. I think the companies will need to have a lot of transparency. They'll really have to understand what is they're actually doing. So there will be a lot of extra cost and sort of that the OEM will be required to have, because they're going to be forced by the regulators to have this information. And a lot of it, remember, at the end of the day, is not only for the voters, particularly in the EU, and probably with the Biden administration here in the United States, you probably see similar type of moves in the United States. but also it's a way to sort of keep things localized, because one of the big carbon emitting is transporting things around the world. If you're more localized produced, then that's something that can reduce your ESG footprint. So if you look at Tesla's presentation, they spent a lot of time saying they wanted to buy from North American sources for their North American cars. Pretty hard for them in Europe because there's not too much there, particularly when you come to like a lithium. But there are saying they should head in that direction. If I'm in big producing countries like Indonesia, which has suddenly come out and said, "Hey, maybe we need to make batteries here," you could see changes in the value stream in that way.
Absolutely. And in terms of the sort of key technology contenders for producing this Class 1 nickel, who's in the race, and how do the technologies compare in terms of their sort of environmental impact, economics, and also the sort of technological challenges of getting these systems to work?
Well, that's where Tesla, if you look at Battery Day, had some of the most interesting charts I've ever seen in my 25 years. And that was, they put up a slide that said, currently we mine ore, we quote unquote, it would say, do a lot of stuff to the ore, then we refine it, and then we do a lot of stuff, and then we have our cathode active material. The Tesla solution is we mine the ore, we do a lot less stuff to it, we refine it, we do a lot less stuff to it, and then we get to our final end. Not really the most technical document I've ever seen. I think what they're saying is rethink it. How can we actually do things? So simple things. Because batteries are becoming the cheapest form of electricity in the world, maybe mining companies should switch their machinery and their operating over to battery. Maybe they should hook those up to wind and solar. There's definite ways that you can build the better mousetrap to try to meet these ESG areas without sort of, coming up with something that no one has ever thought about in the hundreds of years of mining. And I think the mining industry, when they saw the Tesla presentation, really went nuts to try to say how horrible it was and how stupid Tesla was. I think from Tesla's perspective, and I think from the EV battery industry perspective, they're saying, look, we need to rethink things, and there are opportunities that are relatively easy. And often what you're seeing is when companies reduce their ESG footprint, they lower their cost. So I think it used to be you would put in ESG things and your cost would go up and be more of a PR thing for you to do. Whereas today, we've done this with a lot of companies. We use artificial intelligence to try to be much more efficient in the processing of materials, which lowers your ESG. We use electrified mines as we do a number of projects around the world on electrifying the mines. What does it do? It lowers your cost. And so those are things, in addition to sort of making your local community happier because there's not diesel smoke or trucks coming through or things of that nature. There's so many different parts of the puzzle that actually fit. And I think what the EV industry is saying is, can you please try to rethink this? We think you can actually have a better operating model. So it's not against the mining industry. It's trying to have the mining industry rethink things.
But in terms of, right now, who's producing? I mean, there was, for example, the HPAL project that a lot of people were talking about in Indonesia. How is that technology progressing? Are they, working out all the kinks in that and getting the sort of economics that they were promising at the beginning?
Well, there's the billion-dollar question right there. I think you have two camps. The one camp that says, the Chinese did a fantastic job with pig nickel, really transforming the stainless industry, reducing costs and sending nickel prices from 50,000 down to 8,000. And they'll, again, sort of find a way to do all of these HPAL plants. They'll make many of them exactly the same, and therefore they'll be pumping out high-class nickel for the EV industry, and everything's going to be fine. And there's a certain camp in there. The McKinsey camp is sort of, well, let's look at HPAL plants have never really been too easy to start up. Every HPAL plant seems to have some different issues than other HPAL plants. Every nickel deposit, even in the same country, seems to have some sort of different detriment. And it's a very tricky process to begin with. Even the best cases have had all sorts of hiccups, environmental hiccups or other sorts of hiccups. So there are issues here. So we sort of are in the camp of it will be somewhat, the HPAL plants in Indonesia will be somewhat successful. We already have seen a number of the CapEx numbers rise pretty dramatically, and taking everything just, for example, from offshore tailings to dry stacking raises your cost very significantly. We've seen the nameplate capacities that have been announced a couple of years ago start to come down. And we think that will continue to where they'll be somewhat successful. It won't be the panacea. There'll be other nickel assets around the world that will need to be developed. And Indonesia will be a very large key, but we'll probably need much more. And the big question is, how quickly will the EV industry reduce costs of those batteries, which means the demand will be so high for nickel that we'll have to, that's going to be the demand number that the supply needs to meet. And that's sort of the case of bull case and bear case. Where does the technology go versus how quickly can the nickel industry react? And remember, I mean, Musk said publicly he's gone to some of the major nickel miners in the world, and they generally have come back to him and said, at $16,000 nickel, there's no real incentive for us to go out there and spend wildly in nickel. So I think at the end of the day, the industry told Musk, you need to get prices much, much higher for us to be interested to invest massively. And I think that's sort of where we sit today.
In terms of the miners, what they should be producing if they're looking to take advantage of this this sort of coming boom, what is currently the best ore to be mining in order to then for that to be processed into Class 1 nickel in the most sort of simple, environmentally sustainable way?
Well, I think what's really important, what we tell miners is, as important as your geologists are, is your marketing department. Because what you're going to want to do if you're in the nickel industry is you're going to want to get together with the OEMs, with the cell manufacturers, and you're going to ask them, how do you need this nickel processed? Will you need an MHP? Will you need a nickel, some sort of fine or pellets, or do you need a nickel powder or things of that nature? So you actually need to customize your ore in your refining processes to what your customer will need. And that is something that has been very challenging for a lot of mining executives, because they're used to making a commodity as much as they can to meet a general quality standard that they could sell to an exchange or sell to a customer, et cetera. What we're seeing with the EV materials, it's very bespoke, and it's just something that I think the industry needs to get used to. And so get your marketing people together with your geologist and sort of in your refining parts, work them all together, but make sure you're integrated into the industry so that you'll have a customer who will buy your material. And what we've seen is many of the EV companies are out there trying to structure deals with the nickel industry to ensure supply. When you talk to the mining companies, they look at the current price and say there's no problem. Looks like there's oversupply for next year. When you talk to the technology and the EV companies, they're petrified there isn't enough material out there, and they're trying to scramble to secure supply. So somewhere in the middle, you need to meet those miners who are very aggressive to work with the EV companies to provide this material, should get a premium for their product on a long-term basis.
If you were an optimist or a pessimist looking forward, do you think there is going to be enough Class 1 nickel produced? Do you think the industry is going to step up sufficiently?
I mean, looking at where the technology is headed over the last 6 years, the EV industry has consistently lowered cost and improved battery performance more than anybody thought. For example, the movement to 811 chemistries came about 5 years more than anybody thought. And now Tesla says they're going to take, something we didn't think would happen for 10 years and do it in 24 months. From that standpoint, I'm very optimistic on technology and where it's heading. That means we're going to need an awful lot of nickel. And that will be a major challenge that I think will be very, very difficult for the nickel industry to respond to. My concern for the nickel industry would be we actually see huge price spikes over the next 3-4 years. That would force the battery industry to move away from nickel. The most likely candidate would be manganese. There's a lot of issues with manganese, but even Tesla said they're looking at a 2/3, 1/3 nickel manganese battery, up from the 10% manganese today. So we always say, I've been doing this for 25 years, and so true. The cure for high prices is high prices. We saw that in cobalt. We saw that in lithium. I would be a concern while everyone would be dancing in the streets if we saw record high nickel prices. That's probably the worst thing long-term for the nickel industry.
It's a very interesting subject. And I believe that you guys, McKinsey, produced a report on this.
Please go to mckinsey.com. It's free. There's a report on clean nickel that goes through everything in more detail, talking about this. Always can reach out to me. I'm a big LinkedIn guy, and I always work with you guys on your conferences and stuff. So always happy to chat.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Ken. That's a very interesting discussion there, and look forward to speaking with you again very, very soon.
Thank you very much, Leo.